how crazy is it? I just saw this morning, people have tried to do an accounting of how many significant changes in tariffs, either national level or individual products, how many significant tariff changes have taken place since Trump took office. And the answer is more than 50. So in a little over 100 days in office, we basically had a significant change in tariff rates every 2 days over the past few months. The big ones were April 2nd, Liberation Day. Have a hard time not gagging on that. But anyway, Liberation Day on April 2nd, massive, huge tariffs, different for every country, tariffs on everybody, including islands that are populated only by penguins. And then a huge, a totally different set of tariffs a week later. Totally different, often described as a pause, but in fact, the second set of tariffs on average was just as high as the first. And then my wife's out of the country, and I woke up Monday morning to an urgent text from her saying, you need to look at the news now, because we just dropped the tariff on China from 145 to 30%. Which makes less difference than you think, but I'll get to that in a second. Where the United States is right now is 10% tariffs basically on everyone and everything, higher tariffs on certain things, steel, for example, and 30% on China. Give you some perspective. That would be, by historical standards, that's still a very, very high level of protectionism. The average tariff rate, latest estimates I've seen, is that we currently have an average tariff rate, the United States has an average tariff rate of 17.4%. That's up from under 3% just a few months ago. That's in historical perspective, it's just a little bit lower than the Smoot-Hawley tariff of the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. And Smoot-Hawley wasn't, before that tariff, we already had fairly high protectionism. It was only about a 6-point rise in the average tariff rate. This is a 14-point rise in the average tariff rate. And it's taking place in an economy where trade is about 3 times as large as a share of GDP as it was. So this is a trade policy shock that is an order of magnitude bigger than everyone's previous version of this is the worst trade policy shock in history. And it is just completely off the scale. I believe, I haven't been able to check everything, but I think it is the biggest tariff shock in the history of the world. And it's all just happened in the past few months, and it's happened in the United States. You should not think that the tariff reduction that took place over the weekend is it's not as big as it seems. We had a 145% tariff on imports from China, which is prohibitive. There would essentially nothing would be bought from China at that tariff rate. That came down to 30, which is not entirely prohibitive, but is still an enormous barrier to trade. And I think there are a fair number of economists here. Anyway, I've been looking through for estimates of the price elasticity of import demand. How much does a 1% rise in the tariff reduce imports? The consensus estimates seem to be in the range of 4 to 6. So if we take the bottom of that range, the least sensitive, a 30% tariff will not completely eliminate U.S.-China trade. It will only reduce it by 65%. So we're still looking at something that drastically cuts off one of the major trade flows in the world economy. And that's a really big disruption. I've been, I actually just had a long talk, which will be on my Substack on Saturday with Joy Politano, who's really tracking these things very closely, and he's convinced that where we are now is a floor. That what will happen now is that a bunch of additional tariffs that have already been floated will go into effect. Sectoral tariffs, for example, on pharmaceuticals. And so the average tariff rate will probably go higher from here. So unless there's a complete reversal of policy, we're talking about the United States going extremely protectionist. We're currently at the highest tariff rate since 1934, and probably heading higher from here. It's not. Oh, I'm sorry. A bit more. There are a lot of questions. It's all happened so suddenly and in such a disorderly, if you like, fashion that it's really hard to sort out what's happening. So one of the questions I've been asking is the most. I'll talk about Brazil in a moment, and just not to be coy about it, Brazil is a lot less exposed to all of this than many countries are, but Canada and Mexico obviously are enormously exposed. They're our next door neighbors. We had, or supposedly still have, a free trade agreement. We have enormous amounts of trade in a lot of ways. Manufacturing, there is no U.S. manufacturing sector. There's a North American manufacturing sector, which is so tightly integrated that you actually have to kind of look at the serial numbers to discover where your car was made. And we had for a little while there 25% tariffs on that trade, which was absolutely catastrophic. Now the administration has said that the tariffs will not apply to goods that are USMCA compliant. USMCA, it's the agreements like the artist formerly known as Prince. It's the trade agreement formerly known as NAFTA. Basically, we took the existing agreement. It was renegotiated during Trump's first term with really quite minor changes. And it's really effective with the same agreement. So we have a free trade agreement. The latest word is that the tariffs will not apply to goods that are USMCA compliant. So I've been asking experts what that means, and the answer is nobody knows. So we have a trade is free for some things, but we don't quite know what they are. And it's as far as we can make out, customs officials are kind of making it up as they go along. So it's a insanely wild situation. The tariffs are. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm even more nonlinear than I usually am. One important thing to say about all of this is that everything that's happening is a flat violation of existing agreements. The United States had a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, which appears to be only partially valid now. We had a lot of free trade agreements or otherwise. We have a whole system of trading agreements. We agreed to a bunch of stuff in 1994, the last major multilateral trade negotiation, the Uruguay round, which are supposed to be still binding. We have free trade agreements with individual countries like South Korea. We've just broken all of those agreements. So the whole world trading system is basically a U.S. creation. The origins actually go back to U.S. policy in the 1930s, which then became global policy with the creation of the GATT in 1947. And ever since, we've had a system that was kind of, the United States designed it in its own image. It's a very legalistic, rules-based system, very much U.S. style. And it has worked largely because the United States has made a point of obeying its own rules. The WTO the World Trade Organization doesn't have any tanks. Its ability to enforce depends upon the major players agreeing to abide by the rules and sanction countries that don't. And so that used to mean just the United States. Now it's the United States plus the European Union. But still, this is a U.S.-centric system of rules. And now the United States, in addition to the specifics of what we did, we just broke all of our agreements. And henceforth, everybody will know that a trade agreement is not a contract, it's a suggestion. And that changes everything. And it introduces enormous uncertainty. So in terms of the impact on business, if you're trying to make a decision, trying to make an investment decision, it's very, very hard to do anything that even is even touched by international trade. It doesn't even have to be importing or exporting, because so many other things either rely on imported inputs or to some extent involve business from exporters. You are stuck in a position where anything you do is at high risk of turning out to be a complete waste of money. That you've just sunk money into something that is no longer viable. So that's kind of clearly the case if you were thinking about production decisions within North America. Do you want to invest in Mexico? Well, not if there's going to be a 25% tariff. Do you want to build a somewhat higher cost facility in the United States? Well, only if you think the 25% tariff is going to persist. So what you mostly end up doing is neither, sitting on assets. And that, we are still at, I'd say, 50-50 odds of a recession in the United States. People have marked down their pessimism a little bit after this weekend, but normally don't expect tariffs to cause recessions. A tariff reduces imports, which is sort of expansionary. A trade war cuts into your exports, which is contractionary, but normally it should be kind of a wash. Tariffs are certainly inflationary, but recessionary, not usually. But in this case, the sheer uncertainty created by a trade regime that is shifting week by week is almost certainly exerting a major damping effect. So whether it becomes a formal recession or not, we're almost certainly looking at a significant slowdown in the United States. What about the rest of the world? The international spillovers. So I'll give you a bit of good news. The international spillovers beyond North America look a lot more limited than many people have worried. It could be famous last words, but at least as I read it, if you look at the major players in the world economy, okay, the European Union, there are three big guys in the world economy, which is the U.S., China, and European Union from the point of view of trade, Euro area from the point of view of currency, but not a whole lot of difference there. So basically U.S., China, and Europe. Europe is remarkably not that exposed. Europe is currently facing 10% tariff. If we go back to the Liberation Day tariffs, it'll be 20% tariff, which is not a small thing. But Europe only exports about 3% of its GDP to the United States. If you think that the European economy is critically dependent on the U.S. market, no, it matters, but it's not huge. And so it's relatively not fully insulated, but the blowback on Europe should not be all that large. China, China's a very export-oriented economy, but much less U.S. centric than it used to be. At this point, the United States is only 16% of Chinese exports. And now it's true that some of that is exporting to countries that then export on. So U.S. tariff on exports from Vietnam does blow back to some extent on China. But even so, it's not that big a hit. And what's really important is if the United States and China get into a full-blown trade war, which looks a little bit less likely than it did, on Saturday, but it's still a real possibility. You need to think of that as not being purely a tariff war. That would be a war both of tariffs and of export restrictions. And the United States doesn't sell very much to China. Not zero, but it's not a huge thing and very important for agriculture. But we are really quite dependent on China for some crucial inputs. Rare earths being the one that everybody knows about. Also, it turns out certain kinds of batteries, certain kinds of semiconductors. And the Chinese have been they've actually already imposed restraints on some of these things. But if there's ultimately the purpose of international trade is not to export, but to import. That's what you want is the stuff that you get from other countries, not the pieces of paper that you give you in return for your products. And China, in a full-on confrontation, China would impose a lot of export restrictions. If we get into that situation, well, the United States would be cutting off a lot of Chinese exports, which is something that a lot of Chinese factories still do rely on the U.S. market, but the Chinese would be cutting off a lot of inputs that we depend on. And I didn't come up with this, but as somebody said, it's a lot easier to offset job losses with Keynesian stimulus than it is to stand up a manufacturing base that you don't have. So the United States is actually very poorly positioned to deal with a full-on trade conflict with China, and China is pretty well positioned to cope with this. Now they have hang-ups. That's a whole other thing. But China has been weirdly unwilling to pump up consumer demand, to transfer enough income to households to support their economy, and have relied on trade surpluses to fill the gap. And we don't know how deep that reluctance goes. At what point does Xi stop sounding like Premier Xi? Listen to him talk about consumer demand and household income, and he sounds like a conservative Republican talking about how we mustn't make people dependent and lazy and so on. So he clearly has a personal dislike for that idea, but in extremis, I think that would go. By the way, just one thing that is truly amazing is how much everything that's going on is really, you want to talk about social forces and deep political trends, but really to an amazing extent, we're just talking about the minds of a couple of people. There wasn't a strong political movement in the United States demanding these tariffs. In fact, they're immensely unpopular. But because of the way U.S. trade law is written, the president has effectively unlimited discretion to set tariffs. There were reasons we did that, but they all presumed that the president would be somebody very different from the president we currently have. And so this is really, lots of things would be the same if Trump were to disappear from the scene, but tariffs would not. The tariffs is really a one-man obsession, but unfortunately one man who has the power to make that obsession reality. Brazil. So I need to actually run a little bit longer on the non-Brazil parts, and let me talk a bit about Brazil, on which I am not an expert at all. And I have to say that in general, since I began writing, when I was writing for the New York Times, whenever I tried to write about other countries, whenever I tried to write about Brazil or Argentina or even Europe, I would actually get a lot of blowback from readers who would say, go back to, in the old days, go back to bashing Bush or whatever. So I have not paid nearly as much attention as I'd like to. But it's really quite clear, if you look at Brazil, that very few countries are as relatively insulated from what's happening in the United States as Brazil is. only 11% of your exports go to the United States versus 27% to China and 15% to the EU. So the United States is way down on the list of major export markets. Furthermore, Brazil is mostly, even now, tremendous amount of industrial development, substantial technological competence in certain areas of industry, but 2/3 a commodity exporter still. It's basically you export oil and soybeans. That's a caricature, but that's roughly speaking what goes on there. That means that access to any one market matters a lot less. And of course, soybeans is not going to be sold in large amounts to the United States anyway. But just in general, these are commodities that are traded on world markets. And what happens in the United States matters only insofar as it affects commodity prices in the world as a whole. That's not zero. One of the interesting things about what has happened in the Trump months so far is that there really has been a substantial drop in oil prices, which have really gone down quite a lot, and clearly policy linked. If you look at a chart of oil futures, there's just a huge step down on April 2nd. Literally, the day Trump announced his hit, the day he held up those big placards with the tariff rates on them was the day that oil prices fell off a cliff. Not entirely sure what was driving that. I mean, obviously, people became much more pessimistic about the U.S. economy. I think that people also became pessimistic about global economic activity generally, probably to an excessive degree. It's not, again, if I try to work through the channels of interdependence, it's not clear that what the U.S. is doing is going to do a great deal of damage to countries other than the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It will do some, but not probably on that scale. But in any case, aside from that, if I were to really make a pessimistic case for Brazil, it would involve that the entire international economic order collapses. I used to have, as some people, old teachers of mine, used to say that the great danger if the United States turns protectionist is not retaliation, but emulation. That because the United States is no longer playing the game it did, that everybody else will turn protectionist, and that the Europeans will turn protectionist, and that the whole developing world will turn its back on outward-looking policies and back to import substitution and so on. So far, I don't see that happening. But this is very subjective and squishy. But so far, what it looks like is that the rest of the world is trying to find ways to maintain the global system without the United States. And if that's the case, then I don't think that Brazil is particularly on the spiral line.
Dr. Krugman, I have a few questions because I really would like to open this possibility to the audience. But I think that everybody that comes to Brazil, to the US now, read the headlines. We have one question for people that follow politics and economics like you for decades. Is Donald Trump unstoppable?
This is just me as a citizen who reads the news, not any kind of expertise. Trump is not unstoppable, and in fact, I'm feeling, you all know my politics pretty obviously. I'm feeling less terrified than I was a month ago. Still moderately terrified, but it looks to me as if there was a point when it seemed as if everyone was rolling over, when everyone was just too afraid to criticize, to express opposition, and that seems to have stopped. That we are now seeing. It does. The media are not the greatest here, but there are large demonstrations every 2 weeks now. Millions of people demonstrating. The courts have been standing up. The by-elections have been extremely bad news for Republicans. Now, question we all ask, I mean, if I could count on the normal mechanisms of democracy working, I think that it really does look as if the congressional elections next year will be a blowout for Democrats. And in general, the society seems to be not rolling over and submitting to this drive in the way that they were. We don't know what happens. We don't know how far things will go. So far, lots of things that we didn't think were possible are happening. Masked people claiming to be government agents, kidnapping people off the street. The mayor of Newark, right here, temporarily arrested and held in confinement. Harvard researchers who happen not to be U.S. citizens in confinement for weeks. And of course, people disappeared to gulags in El Salvador. But so far, those are not core stuff. I landed at Newark Airport last Tuesday, a week ago, I guess. And I was afraid, but I was afraid of air traffic control, not of being arrested. Not yet.